This video is brought to you by Squarespace. British gangsters. We love them.
I come here for a f***ing shootout, right?
That is God, and that are the Peaky Blinders.
I have to admit, when I finished watching Top Boy, my use of the word bruv increased at least 60%. After Peaky Blinders, I started to look at the flat caps and next. However, today I want to look deeper, and I want to explore the evolution of the British gangster, how it's changed over the years.
Nowadays, they're carrying these zombie knives, the machetes, the sword.
Don't harm women, don't harm kids. All that is out of the window.
The stereotype of a typical gang member is a gun-toting, drugs-dealing African Caribbean high on drugs and rap music. I was about to discover that the truth is very different.
The London Docks is like the OG spot for British gangs. This is kind of like their spawning point. When we move towards the Victorian era, which was 1837 to 1901, in this period, Britain, and specifically places like London, were massively evolving, right? There's tons of money coming in, which in turn created many more opportunities for crime. And it's mainly because there were so many ships coming into London with loads of different goods. Who's gonna notice if a crate full of bickies goes missing? And so gradually, these sort of gangs, these groups of petty thieves would start to organize, and a culture started to form. And we can see it in the way they would talk. They had their own language, Cockney slang.
Do you want a ding on the coconut? Oh, pudding? Yes, please. He's talking about the peelers, you doddy. Is that to peel the cheese or the coconut? The roses.
Now, whilst there'd be a number of little shitboy groups of what you could call gangs, none of them really were like famous until we got to the late 1800s.
The streets are overrun by gangs of young thugs known as scuttlers. For over 30 years, they terrorise the population with constant outbreaks of brutal street violence.
The scuttlers started to make a name for themselves in the 1870s, as violence between groups of scuttlers would pop off in Manchester. And it would be with the scuttlers, I think, where we'd start to see the beginning of like gangster fashion. They would wear these brass-tipped, pointed clogs, bell-bottom trousers cut like sailors. Their hair was always cut short on back and sides, and they would have this fringe called a donkey fringe. And on top of that, they would wear a peak cap tilted to the side to, you know, show off the fringe. When it comes to weapons, they would have knives, but also they had a weird weapon, which was their belt. So they would tie them around the wrist and use it like a fucking abyssal whip on the ops. And as well, they would often have rival gangs. This was kind of the point, and they would fight each other.
Scuttling might have been ignored had it been contained to just the gangs. But when innocent bystanders became targets, public outrage began to grow.
At many points in the 1890s, there were more young people in strange ways held for scuttling than for any other kind of criminal offence.
However, the scuttlers wouldn't last forever. You know, it was about 30 years before they started declining through an approach which is very interesting for the fucking late 1890s, but they started to try and offer the kids things to do other than killing each other. One of these initiatives was creating a football team by the name of St. Mark's West Gorton. This football team went on to become none other than Manchester City.
Manchester City, champions of the land.
However, as time would pass, these gangs would evolve from kids fighting for the sake of it into something more serious, leading us to the Peaky Blinders. Now, obviously, we were going to talk about the Peaky Blinders. You know them. These are them hat boys. You know, cool, calm, sophisticated. However, the TV show is fictional. That isn't what happened in real life, but it was based on a real gang from Birmingham. And this was a group of largely young bros from very working class communities. And you know, they would get their hands dirty with the usual, a bit of violence, a bit of robbery. However, what's interesting about the Peaky Blinders is we really start to see how crime started to become more organized. You start seeing like illegal gambling, you start seeing protection racketeering, bribery, fraud. And as well, fashion-wise, these guys wore their signature outfits. And of course, they too wore the peaked cap, as we know. The Peaky Blinders were successful. They held control of many of these sort of illegal industries for about 30 years. However, as it was proven to be more lucrative to do these sort of dodgy dealings, etc., other gangs started to sniff around and they started getting some ideas, and they would begin to challenge the Peaky Blinders. The Birmingham Boys, led by Billy Kimber, who originally was a Peaky Blinder himself. His gang actually overtook the Peaky Blinders, and by 1920, the Peaky Blinders were no more.
Early in the 20th century, one of the Birmingham gangs, known as the Brummagem Hammers, began to spread from the streets of Birmingham to around the country. And this was all because of one lucrative business: horse racing.
Following a law passed in 1845, gambling was now a very heavily regulated industry. It could only happen at the racetracks. They would go up to the bookmakers and say, "You all right, mate? You know, I can see you got a lot of money floating about. It'd be a shame if some bad people would come here and take it." And they would, you know, very kindly offer themselves as protection for money. However, this would start to make more gangs. You'd see the Hoxton gang, the Elephant and Castle mob, and, you know, sometimes maybe they would kind of extort the bookmakers a little bit. And this led to an incident where one of the groups of Brummies went over to the London East End and started to kind of prey and pick on the Jewish bookies. And that kind of pissed off the Jewish bookies, and they turned to Edward Emanuel, and he recruited the Sabini gang to offer these Jewish bookmakers some protection. The violence escalated and eventually led to the Epsom Road Battle. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. With their new guided design system, you can have your own really unique custom website. You can choose from a professional layout and just select a few different styling options, and it will give you a completely unique and customized design. On top of that, they got these new optimized SEO tools, which are going to help you rank much higher in search results, just making it easier for people to find you. On top of that, they now got very flexible payments. They take Apple Pay, PayPal, and in some countries, you can do buy now, pay later with like Afterpay and ClearPay. But the coolest thing to me is Squarespace's AI. You can just type in a prompt, like you could do your product descriptions, and it will shoot out a really good template, and you can obviously change it and tweak it to match your tone. But it will save you a lot of time, and it's really high quality. So be sure to head over to squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant, and to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. Anyway, back to the video.
And this is where the attack took place. Whole of the road here was littered with bodies. The people in the houses round here were apparently screaming with terror because the Birmingham boys were equipped with guns, with hatchets, house bricks, iron bars, knives, and they really went to work.
The Brummagem all received sentences between 9 months hard labour and 3 years imprisonment. Man like Charles Sabini. Now, this is a geezer who breaks away from the mold. He's no longer just shitboy pickpocket. He's started to make a lot of money, gain a lot of power, and in turn, started to have connections with judges, police, and politicians. And it's because he was such a cool dude, you know, had a good vibe. Had nothing to do with the money he was putting in their pocket. And it's in this period, like the 1920s, 1930s, where Sabini's power really rested on the growing rise of anti-Semitism. And so Sabini's men would offer protection, but this would come at a price.
You've got a nice army base there, Colonel.
Yes?
We wouldn't want anything to happen to it.
No, what my brother means is it would be a shame if
Oh,
sorry, Colonel.
Anyway, as I say, in the 30s, this is like Oswald Mosley. This is the rise of fascism in Britain. And he has his own gang called the Black Shirts, who were in part the Billy Boys, which was led by Billy Fullerton, who was a gang that reigned terror all over Glasgow.
You fight with your fists?
No, we'll use hatches, no.
I did a whole video on Mosley, so we won't get into that too deep. I'll link it below. But basically, Mosley was trying to do a fascism to Britain. And he too would also show this sort of growing trend of originally underworld crime and gangs starting to influence mainstream society and kind of be embraced. Famously, Lord Rothermere, who owned the Daily Mail, in 1934 ran a piece with the headline, "Hurrah for the Black Shirts." This is a lord, like this is the top of British society, accepting some of the darkest criminals in the country. In response to this growing feud between the fascists and the Jews, a gang called the Jewish Yiddishers would be set up to protect them. And their leader was the famous Jack Spot.
My name is Jack Spot, and they used to call me the governor. And all I did was to defend the Jews.
Whitechapel, East London. Since the turn of the century, home to thousands of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe. They were easy prey to local English thugs. But the sons of the refugees did not stand idly by. One of them was Jack Comer, better known as Jack Spot.
Jack Spot was the financier of a group called 43 Group. This was an anti-fascist Jewish group that would fight the far right. That group, as well, was supported by politicians, by Labour MPs. And on top of that, also entertainment giants. You had a guy called Jack Solomon and Bud Flanagan. And all
all of this tension, all this beef would eventually lead to the Battle of Cable Street, where basically the anti-fascists beat the shit out of the fascists, and yeah, this was a crazy, very important moment in British history, and deep behind it was all these gangs and gangsters who were now rubbing shoulders with mainstream society and politicians. They were becoming increasingly influential. In this time as well, it's very important to note that 1920 was when the opium ban happened, which created a whole new industry for the gangsters to move into, to gain more power, more respect, and more wealth, and with all of that, the ability to cultivate PR.
What are you going to do now that it's all over?
I like to have a bit of family life now, you know. I intend to get married in the near future. I did before this case, but it's put back over the case, and I should get married as soon as possible, you know.
Post-World War II, something happened to the British gangs. They started to become like celebrities. You would have the Firm, based in Bethnal Green, led by none other than the Kray twins. The Krays had control over 14 square miles of London. They owned pubs, casinos, bars, all of the businesses would be paying for their protection. And they were like any other gang, you know, they're involved in the usual, the murder, the bribery, the robbery, the arson, the gun crime, protection racketeering, illegal gambling, assault. But you know, that's your bread and butter, that's your basics for a gangster. But what really made the Krays very, very different was how in the 1960s they gained celebrity status. Instead of the way that the old gangsters were hiding in the shadows so, you know, they don't go to jail, the Krays owned all these popular nightclubs and they'd invite celebrities, very famous people. They would do professional photo shoots, television interviews, all whilst having control over London's criminal underworld. And on top of it, the Krays were beloved. Like, people loved them. And it's because they were perceived to be like Robin Hoods.
One of their closest friends was mourning Ronnie's death.
They were good guys, they were good gangsters, if you want to use such a word. They wouldn't harm women or children, they were untouchable.
If people want to talk about the victims like Jack McVitie or George Cornell and that, they were hardened criminals the same as him. They would have done to Ronnie and Reggie what they'd done to them, and that must always be remembered.
The Krays, at least publicly, made a very concerted effort to portray themselves as having a kind of code of conduct. They wouldn't hurt innocents, women or children, and this careful image cultivation worked. And you can see that if you look at their bloody funerals.
Route took the procession along streets the Kray twins used to rule with their own brand of terror and protection rackets back in the early 60s.
However, we have to ask some questions. How real was this image that they had cultivated?
Others, though, were under no illusions. For the policemen who finally caught the Krays, they were far from glamorous heroes.
There's no question about what prevented witnesses giving evidence to suggest that the Krays are involved, and that was terror. Just absolute fear and terror.
I think they're an extraordinarily murderous, effective pair of gangsters. I think that's been covered up, I say, with a lot of schmaltz, a lot of silly sentimental twaddle, but they were very, very good at their job. If they hadn't started killing people, they probably would have been in the House of Lords by now.
A geezer by the name of Tony Lambrianu, I don't know, he was a former member of the Firm, and he sweared by the fact that this image that the Krays created was a complete myth. Now, this idea of like a myth is very interesting because it leads us to the gentleman gangster.
It was a mixture of fear and respect. Respect because women and children, untouchable. Ordinary guys who went to work and that, untouchable. Any rows we had was only amongst ourselves, and if we hurt or killed one another, so what?
To this day, there is a very common belief that gangsters of the past were gentlemen. Like, sort of, they were kind of good people. And we would see this particularly through films like The Godfather, who would sort of romanticize the mafia, who, you know, do very bad things to innocent people, and it claimed that they had a kind of code of conduct. And this mythology does a lot of heavy lifting for the gangsters of the past to kind of act as though they were somehow much less brutal and much less awful than the gangsters of today. However, the reality of this is very debated. The Krays carried out many awful murders.
I'm glad they're 6 foot under the best place they can be. Yeah. They were two horrible bastards. You don't hurt your own, but they hurt anybody then.
They were really frightening if you really knew them.
People who say they're lovely boys didn't know them.
They were bloody animals.
I thought they should be ironed out, to be honest.
You thought the Krays should have been shot?
the two of them.
They extorted innocent businessmen into paying protection, and if they didn't, they would assault them. Disposing of bodies was very easy back then, and they did it a lot, so we'll never know the full scope of how many innocent people they may or may not have killed, or people below them might have killed. But in the proven murders that they carried out, they were absolutely brutal and often done just for fun or a show of power. As well, when it comes to women, like the psychological abuse of Reggie Krays' wife called Frances led her to taking her own life, while some people speculate that actually they might have murdered her. You know, but despite all of that, somehow the pair have enjoyed this sort of image of being gentleman gangsters.
At St Matthew's Church, a huge cry went up as Reggie appeared, greeted more like a film star than a criminal.
And so have most of that era. Their rivals called the Richardson Gang, who also were known as the Torture Gang. It's alleged that when they would torture people, they would pull out their teeth, cut their toes off, and nail victims to the floor. You know, gentleman stuff.
And when the car arrived, I kidnapped him, slung him in the car, took him to our one-armed bandits, the length of machines, and done it with an axe. Really done it. And on one occasion, he put his hands over his head, and the axe went right through his fingers and nailed his hands to his head.
And we have to massively bear in mind that the police and the judges were often bribed by these gangs. And so then you wonder, why did they turn to gangsters for protection and not the police? Probably because the police didn't do their job in the slums of Britain. People in this era didn't trust the police at all. They probably would never report most of the crimes, most of the murders that might have happened to innocent people, women and children. So I would not be surprised that in the shadows of history, there are some very dark stories that we'll never know about.
Nowadays, I mean, it's all on film, these cameras, videos from the cameras now. I mean, in them days, you were lucky to find a phone box that worked.
Now look, I talk about this because it's important, right? It's important when we now think about modern gangs.
Have a look at this. I'm now brandishing in front of you a 21-inch, brutal-looking black knife. It is sharp, believe you me.
It's terrifying.
It is terrifying.
Old school mafia, don't harm women, don't harm kids, all that is out of the window. Whoever terrorizes the other postcode the most will dominate the drug market.
But the real problem is actually much bigger than that. The animals have taken over the zoo.
These are gangs that we see today and we have much more visibility of. Due to better reporting of crimes, better policing, technology, surveillance, camera. The romantic image of old gangsters is very likely because they didn't have this sort of same visibility. However, as good as it is that we now report and we can record and see what is going on, it has a negative effect of a perceived increase in crime and brutality amongst gangs.
So a lot of the research I did, when you look at scholars like Andrew Davies, who writes books about the history of gang crime in Glasgow and Manchester, or Robert McKilwee, who's got volumes of stuff about the history of gang crime in Liverpool, what you see firstly is that this is not a new problem. Every generation pretends gang crime is a new problem. So when you look at the press reports they cite in their scholarship, it's this same sort of sense of moral panic, this unprecedented thing. When actually we've had violent teenage youth gangs for 150, 200 years, maybe even longer.
Like, I'm not kidding you. Go to a pub and talk to an old geezer about gangsters of today versus the past. He'll probably tell you that they didn't even use knives. They settled everything with their fists and, I don't know, fucking slam poetry sessions. And this image is often romanticized through television and films. And it has a massive impact on how we look at modern gang culture.
My most dangerous assignment was to uncover the hidden world of organised football violence. England has the worst record of football violence in Europe, and it's on the increase.
So from the 70s onwards, we'd have some different waves of types of gangs. We'd have the football hooligan gangs, I've made a video on that, but many of those went from fighting on football terraces to doing very bad crimes. You had the Chelsea headhunters, known for armed robbery, arms smuggling, drug trafficking, neo-Nazi shit. Jesus, look at this list of crime, my God. You'd have British triad gangs, such as Big Circle Gang, 14K, and some other names that I'm gonna butcher if I try and pronounce. And these guys were known for drug smuggling, extortion, and also human trafficking.
Mr. Yao, or should I say Georgie Pye. My name's Roger Cook.
from Central Television, and I'd very much like to talk to you about your activities as a triad, as perhaps Britain's senior triad.
From the 70s and 80s in Brixton, you have gangs like the Black Panther Militia, the 28s. A lot of these were referred to as yardie gangs. But you see, throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, society became more and more aware of these black gangs, particularly in the 2000s as black culture started to be seen more through music, television and film. And so the media just shifted gears to really only focusing on these black gangs.
In districts like Hackney, more than half the black boys grow up without a father. They perform poorly in schools and do not really have good prospects on the job market. For many of them, the only way to make money is through pushing drugs and joining a gang.
When it comes to gangs, race is really interesting to talk about because it's very important. Lots of gangs historically have formed through these kind of racial groups. And so from my research, it seems that in this same period of time, like the 90s, there would actually be a growing rise of Asian gangs, Pakistani gangs. So whilst in the UK, we were relatively aware of Southeast Asian gangs in the 90s, like the Triad gangs. However, for all of the talk these days that we hear about Asian gangs, Pakistani gangs, Muslim gangs, reporting of the history of these gangs, like in the 80s and 90s, is kind of difficult. I couldn't find a lot. From what I could find, there was a gang called the Lynx Gang, Holy Smokes and Tootie Nungs. These were mainly established in Southall from about the 60s onwards in response to racist attacks they were getting from the National Front. However, as that threat from the National Front decreased, the gangs became a problem themselves as they started to extort their local community and deal drugs, etc. And it's interesting to me how little I could find about this thing that had been going on since the 60s. And it really, again, begs this same question of how we only tend to become aware of a thing that may already be happening when the media starts reporting of it more. And as we become more and more aware, these things become better documented and we feel like we see them more.
Brigadier Billy Wright did what he had to do to ensure that our faith and culture was kept intact.
Like, think about it. How often do you hear about Irish gangs now? During the Troubles, which was like the 60s to sort of late 90s, Irish criminal gangs, particularly with links to the IRA, would receive tons of media coverage. You'd have the UDA, the UVF, who were involved in, you know, all the usual gang type activities, who were also very highlighted for how brutal they were. Things like kneecapping, tarring and feathering, where they would pour hot tar on their victim, cover them in feathers and make them walk down the street. And many of the victims of these crimes were women who were being accused of having relationships with British soldiers. And of course, there was also the terrorism. They were literally bombing civilians. They also had a group called the Shank Hill Butchers, who were known to abduct and kill random innocent Catholics. And, you know, sometimes a few Protestants if they made a mistake and thought they were Catholic. And so I say all this because of the amount of intrigue and fascination we have about gangs and gang culture. The media seems to only focus on certain types of gangs, typically certain ethnicities, as and when they're relevant to the sort of political discourse of the era.
But first, Muslims have won the vicious power struggle between British prison gangs, according to the hero of the London Bridge terror attack.
And also the Irish gangs that we really cared about in the 80s and 90s. You never hear about them in media, even though they are organised in some of the highest levels of criminality.
The Kinahans have grown from a local Dublin gang into Ireland's most powerful internationally recognised criminal organisation.
So as of today, the Kinahan Transnational Criminal Organization joins the ranks of Italy's Camorra, Mexico's Los Zetas, Japan's Yakuza, and Russia's thieves-in-law.
Those people who analyse it as a race problem.
Yeah.
These are black gangs, these are Asian gangs, these are...
This is fascinating. I mean, let's just look at the maths. There are 1.2 million black people in London. In a bad year, 50 of them will kill someone. That's less than 0.004% of the black population. Just to contrast, in a bad year in Glasgow, say 2005, there were 40 murders. There were only 600,000 people in Glasgow. So that year, a Glaswegian as a whole was twice as likely to be killed as a black Londoner. Whereas the commonalities, when you actually look at the demography of violent crime, the commonalities remain the same in Glasgow, Liverpool, Belfast, Naples, or London. Racial explanations are sort of way out for the powers that be, a way out for the wider society. And it's revealing that what happens in London is black on black crime. Okay, what happens in Glasgow, race is not important, or Liverpool, race is not important.
So let's look.
I think from the 2000s onwards, our perception of gangs probably did change a bit. And I think a lot of it's through TV shows and films. Stuff like Adulthood, Kidulthood, Top Boy, a growing focus on the modern black gangs in London, along with the rise of grime music, but then more particularly drill music later on, which really over-glamorizes gang culture. You'd have people like the Peckham Boys, Marley Boys. There's literally just so many London postcode gangs, I can't really list all of them. There are YouTube channels that delve into all of the different beefs between them and all the different gang wars. Even like drill groups would be gangs, and they would have these wars in the streets and then rap about them in the music. And the sort of London black gang has changed the fashion as well. Now, like, we'd call it a roadman. They sort of wear black puffer jackets, balaclavas, Nike Air Max, all this kind of look. And I think when we talk about all these films and musicians, etc., it's sort of created like a victim of its own success, where now that is what people think of when they say about gangs. They think of black gangs. And this perception can create a massive problem when it comes to actually trying to solve gang culture. There's a report here from the CSJ, and they say gang culture is often referred to as a black problem. Evidence shows that this is not the case. Overall, ethnicity of gang members tends to reflect the ethnicity of the population they live. Hence why Easter House Estate in Glasgow are predominantly white gangs, and gangs from Brixton are predominantly black. The higher proportion of black gang members reflects the disproportionate amount of black communities living in deprived inner city neighborhoods. Also, on top of the whole racial thing, it gives us a very London-centric view of gang culture, which again can be unhelpful. If we look at statistics for what town is like the most criminal, Cleveland in Merseyside ranks #1 for most dangerous place to live in the UK, not London.
We're in Middlesbrough, the biggest town right in the heart of Cleveland and the UK's epicentre for criminal activity. New statistics show the rate of recorded crime across Cleveland police stands at 141.7 per thousand people. To put that into context, that's nearly 40% higher than London's Metropolitan Police and over 50% above the rate for England and Wales. The area has the highest rate of sexual offences in the country, the second highest rates of knife crime, and the fourth worst rate for drug offences.
And the highest murder rate by police force area. But you know, we always talk about London, but when do you hear about Cleveland? And is it not kind of interesting that Cleveland happens to be 92% white, so it doesn't really play into this perception and perhaps doesn't get as much coverage?
When the media and the police put out pictures of the sort of knife that they are actually taking in, because some young people, it kind of glorified them, thinking, well, they need to step up their game. Back in the days, when you had a gang of maybe up to 10 people, maybe 1 or 2 might be carrying a weapon. Nowadays, they're carrying the zombie knives, the machetes, the sword.
And I say all that to give us perspective, right? It's not to say that gangs aren't awful and brutal today, they definitely are. But to sort of pretend that this is a new phenomenon and it hadn't existed in past is just unhelpful. However, I think it is fair to say that gangs probably do escalate violence over time. One of the evolutions of modern gangs is a new crime called county lines, where drug dealing from London is spread out through networks into more rural communities. This is bringing drugs and crime, stabbings, etc. into more rural areas of England. So whereas gangs were very much isolated and localized to London, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, now they're starting to be seen in more rural communities where previously these were like peaceful middle-class neighborhoods. This in turn is more newsworthy and increases the reporting on these activities. So this is a clear evolution, showing that gang culture is spreading and moving around areas that previously it didn't. And look, it's not far-fetched to say that gangs do escalate violence, like gang wars, beefs get passed down, and if one side is doing more brutal means, then probably you're going to adopt that. So yeah, you can escalate gang brutality over generations. However, I do think this romantic image of gangsters of the past is really just a sort of nostalgia and a common trope that every generation has, where they think that the youth are now worse than they were before. And the problem with this kind of rhetoric, this kind of way of thinking about gangs, as it hinders our ability to understand and empathize and ultimately solve the root causes of why people are drawn into gangs in the first place.
The face comes of being shot in the leg, you know.
Have you stabbed someone before?
Yeah.
That's really disturbing to see that.
I'm disturbed, mate. We're all disturbed, you know, because we're all the same. We all grow up through the same shit, and no one breaks the cycle. It's hard around here. The cycle never breaks.
And the social indicators of that violence have remained identical for almost 200 years.
And those social indicators are?
Poverty, Domestic abuse, lack of education, so expulsion from school. So for example, almost half the people in prison today in Britain were expelled from school as children versus just 1% in the population as a whole. Among young people, about half the young people in young offenders institutes were at some point in care growing up versus about 1% in the population as a whole. So you still need to get to the root causes of the reason.
But that takes money and commitment. That means prioritising this end of crime.
And it means believing that the young people who are dying are important and valuable, and being willing to have a nuanced and human view of young people that do sometimes very, very bad things.
The reason that people join gangs is very well understood. There's lots of research into this. The obvious things like poverty, deprivation, bad schooling, bad education, breakdowns in family units, breakdowns in systems, lead people who are at the very bottom of society to feel a bit lost. Gangs, in a sad way, offer an identity and a family unit, and also an opportunity to make money and make something of yourself. Instead of spending £6.8 billion a year on our overcrowded prisons, I think we could probably redirect some of that money into solving the economic problems that leads people to join these gangs in the first place.
Do you never worry about the actual how serious it sometimes can get? All we basically worry about is who we stabbing this weekend.
Why do you guys keep fighting if it's so dangerous?
Pride. Pride.
Sorry, don't hang your pansy.
What we got to do? Go on the street wall. What's we got to do? They ain't giving nothing for us. They got nothing for us to do.
Nowadays, someone getting stabbed over nothing is nothing, man.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, jump on the Discord where we can talk about this further. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.